Brought to you by Total War Warhammer. Colossal battles, addictive empire building, hundreds of hours of strategic gameplay. Order now and get Chaos Warriors free.
Hi guys, I'm Lucy and welcome to a slightly unusual episode of Reality Check, brought to you this week by our friends at Total War Warhammer. They say history is written by the victors, the Romans, the Allies, and in the case of the Battle of Waterloo, the Duke of Wellington. Not so good for his opponent, the actually average-sized for the time Frenchman Napoleon Bonaparte, who after his defeat ended up being exiled and losing everything he'd ever worked for. Admittedly, he was exiled to a tropical island, but he still died pretty miserably. So I got thinking, what would happen in an alternate version of the Battle of Waterloo? What if Napoleon's men hadn't been defeated? What if Napoleon's men weren't men at all? Instead, what if Napoleon had orcs? So before we delve into our reimagined Battle of Waterloo, let's have a brief history lesson to find out why it was even happening at all. In the early 1800s, Napoleon Bonaparte had quite the career. A military man who'd risen up through the ranks of the French army, eventually seizing control of the entire country in a bloodless coup d'etat. Being a brilliant military tactician, the now Emperor Bonaparte managed to conquer much of Europe, but he got a little big-headed and fell victim to one of the classic blunders, getting involved in a land war in Russia. It didn't go very well and he was stripped of his rank and exiled for about a year before coming back and resuming power. So naturally, the first thing he wanted to do was try and take over the rest of Europe, which obviously annoyed everyone else, so the British, Prussians, Russians, and Austrians ended up banding together to take him down. A couple of days before Waterloo, on June 16, 1985, Napoleon's troops managed to force the Prussians into retreating at the Battle of Ligny, which meant that they weren't present for Waterloo, or at least at the very beginning. So when the stage for the Battle of Waterloo was set, with Wellington's 68,000 men, obviously minus the Prussians, who were on their way, versus Napoleon's 72,000. So already Napoleon had the numbers, but he made a couple of critical errors in judgment when leading his troops, and ended up losing. Which is pretty much where his story ends. However, I find alternate history stories like The Man in the High Castle really interesting, and I'm also a big fantasy nut. So I enlisted the help of senior games designer Richard Aldridge from the Creative Assembly to let me know what would actually happen to Waterloo if there had been orcs in the equation instead. Well, let's start how humans and orcs differ. I mean, hopefully we should all have some first-hand experience with how humans behave, but what do orcs do in their day-to-day lives?
They just fight. You know, that is what an orc's life is all about. They wake up in the morning and they want to go out there and start smashing stuff up or smashing people up. And if there's nobody to fight, they will start fighting themselves. Discipline really isn't their forte. They really want to be fighting. And if there's teeth or some loot at the end of it, yes, you can sort of get them to go and do your bidding, but they pretty much want to do what they want to do.
We know that the armies in the early 1800s held some quite sophisticated weaponry. They were armed with muskets, which were lethal at several hundred yards but inaccurate. They had bayonets for stabbing, slow reloading rifles, cannons, and of course swords. Although all of the above might require a little bit too much dexterity for our orc pals to be able to use.
I don't think so. I think their hands are too big for one thing. They loot, they pillage, they steal stuff, they bind stuff together. They're constantly looking for sharp, pointy, spiky, rusty things and then sticking them all together, and that's what you sort of get with their chariots and things of that nature. Trying to find a way to make odd weapons and crude weapons.
Admittedly, the most sophisticated projectile that orcs have is firing a small goblin out of a cannon. So they're maybe a little bit behind in terms of advanced weaponry, but you can't fault them for strength and endurance.
They are tough. They're not the quickest. They certainly are not the brightest either. So, they do somewhat follow each other a little bit, I guess, like sheep. But yeah, they're ferocious. I mean, their want for violence basically just keeps them driving on. And it's really only if, a large proportion of them are, fallen by the wayside where they op it out of battle.
And the fact that they have access to supernatural powers definitely works in their favour.
So you've got Goblin Shaman, you've also got Orc Shaman. Now, Goblin Shaman, they specialise in the law of Little War. That's different, so they've got different spells to the Orcs. They specialise in the law of Dabigwa. They do worship Gork and Mork. They're their two Orc gods. And they've got some pretty cool things. You know, they call upon Gork and Mork. And one of the spells that they have literally gets Gork to slam his foot down and crush people underneath it. And then likewise for the goblins in a little while, they also look towards the Chaos Moon as well. So we had the Curse of the Bad Moon, which can do some pretty horrific damage to people if conjured up.
But back to Waterloo. Napoleon made a crucial mistake which ended up costing him the battle. It had rained the night before, making the battlefield all muddy and waterlogged. So instead of attacking at the crack of dawn, he made his troops wait until after midday. This was so the ground could dry, which was a good idea in theory. But sadly, this did give the Prussians time to get to the battlefield. There was about 30,000 Prussians, and when they arrived, the outnumbered French began to flee. But if Napoleon had been commanding Orcs, Rich thinks they might have fared a little better with the waterlogged battlefield.
They'll wade through it, they'll put up with it, but it's not really part and parcel of them. They come from a very arid, dry place in the old world. So yeah, if they have to get their toe wet, I guess they will, but not out of choice. I don't think they often go for a dip. They're pretty stinky.
So the Orcs might have been able to secure a victory for Napoleon after all. But then, at the end of the day, once all the fighting was over, would Napoleon be able to keep a grip on his Green Army?
I think it'd be quite a bloody massacre. I think he'd put up a good fight, valiant attempt. I think the Orcs come out on top.
I do wonder what would have happened to history if Napoleon had won at Waterloo. Would us British folk all be speaking in French, or would the Allies have banded together once again and taken him out for good? I hope you enjoyed this slightly more irreverent look at history. Let me know in the comments below. Thank you for watching this week's episode of Reality Check.